When I entered the study, Chris was already sitting at a large wooden table, his hands carefully folded and his face with some inexplicable excitement, and his interest and determination always bought me over, because for most students, literature was just another boring subject. But in Chris' eyes, there was a fire that I remembered burning in me when I was young, when literature was my world, and my days were long gone, my home, my work, my occasional meeting with friends, but there was nothing alive left in them. Jean, my husband, was always busy. His career as a lawyer demanded a lot of attention and didn't leave time for conversation or even just the look that once took my breath away. It was like we lived together, but we hadn't been together for a long time, maybe even since he was recognized in the professional community, and he started to devote himself to his work with even more passion than I had. I couldn't tell you what was missing from our lives, but it was completely gone, leaving a gray wasteland. Chris's attention on my face brings me back to reality. We were going to talk about Jennings tonight. I opened the notebook, but I barely have time to say the opening words, and Chris comes alive and starts talking, interrupting me and asking questions. His dust is kindling something in me that has been dormant for a long time, asking me about Jennings, as if he sees him as a living person, not just a subject for an exam. At first I'm surprised, but soon I find myself enjoying his passion, like warming up from something stuck, forgotten how to live. We discuss a story about man and the sea, about struggle and loneliness, about what gives us the strength to go on when everything around us is against us. I'm surprised to find that his views are strikingly similar to my own. At one point he looks at me particularly carefully, and then, suddenly with some embarrassment, he says, "I always thought teachers said that because they had to. But you seem to really like it, don't you?" I smile and try to keep the look of a professional, but his words still hurt something deep inside me. Literature is what makes people feel. This is where our conversation seems to end, but it's really just beginning. In the next few days, our lessons become more than just work for me. I'm there early, I'm there for a long time, and I'm noticing that my mind is often wandering in the middle of class. And as the weekend comes, it's harder for me to let go of my thoughts about Chris, and John doesn't notice the change, and I'm still just one element of his stable life. Every morning he goes to the office, and his constant business style and constant phone calls become a symbol of our alienation. And at some point I ask myself, is he really alive, or has he just long ago chosen this job as a reliable, successful professional, a role that I thought had replaced everything else? Or maybe I lost myself with him, and on Monday, Chris is back in my office, and this time his smile seems a little more sincere, and he's joking, and I'm laughing, feeling like a teenager. We're talking about literature again, but not just Jennings. We're going to step aside. We're talking about life and the challenges, how words can change our perception of reality. Suddenly Chris says, "Your life should be interesting too. There's something about your look." I'm stuck, not knowing what to say. Nobody's asked me these questions for a long time. John seemed to have stopped asking them a long time ago. I say, "I think all teachers seem interesting to their students." "That's okay." "Yes, but not all teachers." He looks at me. I don't know how to say it, but "You seem to have a secret." A secret. I smile at myself. I thought I had no more secrets, but maybe I was wrong. Now, every lesson with Chris was a little celebration for me, a short break in a series of days filled with routine, and every time I noticed that I was looking forward to our meeting with an excitement that I try not to show, but maybe I don't always succeed. And on Friday night, after Chris left, I decided to talk frankly with John. We hadn't discussed anything personal in a long time, and it seemed that we were left with only matters of life and work. I felt that our dinner conversations were more like business partners than people who once truly loved each other. We were sitting in the living room over a glass of wine, and I decided to break the silence without looking up. "John, don't you think we've become too distant?" He just nodded, raising his eyebrows slightly, as if he was ready for that sentence. But his response was completely unexpected. "Juliet, we just have different interests." "That's okay," he said, returning to the laptop screen. You know I'm busy. I felt a slight anger, a suppressed irritation, and I wanted to ask him if I was interested or if I was just the background of his life. His words sounded like an invisible line that he hadn't let me cross in a long time. I got up without saying a word, and I went to my bedroom, feeling his indifferent gaze. On Saturday morning, I went to a coffee shop near the college, determined to take advantage of the time to prepare for my class. I didn't expect to see you here. It was Chris. I was surprised, but to my surprise, I didn't feel any discomfort, as if meeting him was the most natural thing. We said hello, and he smiled and offered to sit with me. I thought it would be illogical to at least refuse him, because we were talking lightly without tension like old friends, even though we had only known each other for a few weeks, and he was talking about his childhood, his love for books, his father, who was rarely home, and who had a difficult relationship with him. And Chris spoke with an openness that I hadn't seen in my close friends for a long time. At one point, he looked me in the eye and said, "Sometimes I feel like I'm more myself around you than I am around anyone else. It's weird, isn't it?" I was rushing. Chris' words sounded so painfully sincere, and that made them resonate even more deeply inside me. I was confused, feeling warm and awkward. But I tried not to look at it, and I said, "Chris, you know there should be boundaries between teacher and student." And I said quietly, as if I were reminding myself, "I understand, but I can't do anything," he said without looking away. "This is something I can't explain." They touched the very string that had long been in me, that I tried not to touch for fear of breaking it all at once. Yes, I wanted to forget about the boundaries. I wanted to experience something real, something I had missed for years. I wanted to feel alive again. But I couldn't tell him. And I went home and I thought about what he said, about this strange sense of closeness that I hadn't had in a long time. And Chris opened the door for me to a world where emotions, not just words, where looks and intonation matter more than anything else, but I had a responsibility. I knew I had to keep that door closed, but in the next class, I felt like I wanted to hear what he had to say about me again, and we were talking about Fitzgerald and his Great Gatsby, and we were talking about the stupidity and the futility of looking for something that doesn't bring happiness. And Chris surprised me again, saying, "You know, when I think about Gatsby, I think he just couldn't find his place. He loved what he couldn't have, but it made him stronger, didn't it?" I nodded slowly, feeling him touch some part of me again, like he saw my longing, my hidden desire to break out of the box. And I suddenly realized that I didn't want this conversation to end. We continued talking, forgetting about the time, and at some point I noticed that our eyes were on each other a little longer than usual. It was as if something subtle had brought us together. That evening I tried to talk to John again. Once again he just waved, citing fatigue. A feeling of emptiness and frustration overwhelmed me. I realized that my attempts to change things with him were no longer working. It was my own closed circle. I tried, he rejected, and then I tried again. For the first time in a long time, I wanted to give up trying. It was a dangerous thought, but I couldn't shake it off. Every day, it was harder for me to be around John. Between us, it was like a wall, rough, cold, impenetrable. My attempts to make any emotional contact were met with his indifference and constant preoccupation with work. It was like a circle, and I was trying to get him interested to talk about us, our problems, how long it had been, but every time he would just wave back, like he didn't even have to pretend that he cared. And at some point I didn't want it, and I decided to stop trying and stop waiting for something to change. I began to find comfort in the thought of Chris being there, so clearly showing an interest that I hadn't allowed him to fully uncover, and our class became an island for me to escape from the harshness of my marriage, even though I knew I was balancing on the edge. We were sitting in a nearly empty classroom at the end of a long hallway, and I noticed something on his face that was disturbing, as if he was haunted by some mystery, and at one point I stopped and I said, "Chris, are you okay?" He looked down and said quietly, "Juliet, you're lonely too, aren't you?" I was surprised by his words, and I felt something cramp in my chest. And he said it so simply, so sincerely, as if he knew my pain, as if he could see through me. even though I could barely understand it myself. Chris looked at me, waiting for an answer, and I realized at that moment that I couldn't lie. Yes, Chris, I answered quietly, looking him in the eye. Sometimes I feel really lonely. We were silent. It was a confession that didn't need to go on. He seemed surprised, but at the same time, I could see a certain relief in his eyes, as if my answer had given him permission for something. At that moment, there was a silence between us that was deeper than any words could ever be spoken. And since we crossed that line, our encounters began to change, and we began to talk about things that I had long been forbidden to do, as if in his presence I was allowing myself to be a different version of myself, more open, more alive, and I began to look forward to our encounters in a way that I had never expected in my life. I was embarrassed to admit it to myself, but meeting him became more than just literature classes for me. It was a chance at life that I hadn't wanted for a long time. One night, before I went to bed, I found John's phone, which he had left on a crappy dresser, and I picked it up to put it on the charger. And then I saw a pop-up message from his colleague. It wasn't anything special, but it was a strange feeling that stuck in my mind. John wasn't a man who forgot things in his sight. His phone was always locked, always out of reach. But this time he left it here on the nightstand, as if on purpose. I opened it, and inside my phone I found a bunch of messages, all from the same woman, Laura. I tried to tell myself that it was just a colleague, but the content of the correspondence left no doubt. They discussed the meetings in common, recalled the days, left hints and half-tones that I could not ignore. It was like a blow to the chest. All my attempts to get closer to John, all my pain, ignored by him for so long, suddenly had an explanation. It turned out that he had been living a different life for a long time, hidden from me, and there was someone in it that he had long preferred to me. I went back to the bedroom feeling broken, but strangely, I didn't feel any pain. Instead, a wave of misunderstanding came over me. I looked at the ceiling for a long time, realizing that the marriage I had worked so hard to bring to life had long since died. I finally let myself admit that I wasn't just lonely. I was deceived. The next day in class, Chris noticed me. I tried to act like I was normal, but he saw me through. We were talking about Steinbeck, about heroes fighting a hostile fate, when he suddenly put his hand on my shoulder and said quietly, "If you want, I'm ready to listen. I know something is wrong right now." I looked at him for a long time. His eyes were full of sincerity and genuine concern. I knew he was ready to listen, ready to understand what no one else understood all these years. But it seemed so forbidden that I couldn't just open up to him. But something broke inside me, and I gave up, looking away. "Chris, I find it hard to talk about it." I finally answered. Maybe I let myself down too much. He leaned softly closer, without taking his eyes off. "Julia, sometimes letting yourself be something is the only thing that helps you live." Those words hit me again, like he understood me like no one else. And at that moment, for the first time in years, I felt like I really had someone to lean on. We talked about Bucks, but behind every page were our thoughts, naked and extremely personal, and it seemed that there was now a thin, invisible thread between us that connected us with something much more than just our shared love of literature. And Chris looked at me in a way that no one had looked at me in a long time. And his eyes, open, attentive, almost naked, made me feel alive again, but I was still tormented by guilt, and I knew I couldn't just leave it there. And everything I learned about John and his double life had touched me, and as hard as it was, I still couldn't decide to have a real conversation with him. And it was going to be the last step, and there was no going back, and I had to decide if I was ready for it. And in the next class, Chris looked unusually depressed, and even his passion for literature seemed to have disappeared, and he was leafing through the book, ignoring my attempts to get him into the discussion, and at one point I couldn't stand it, and I said, "Chris, you're not the same person you are today." "I know I shouldn't burden you with my problems," he said, "but I have no one else to talk to." Those words touched me more deeply than I could have imagined. I felt that he trusted me not only as a teacher, but as a person who might need his support as much as he needed mine. "Tell me if you want," I said softly. He blinked as if in doubt, but then he started anyway. "It's my parents. Their marriage is strange, as if they live on different planets. It's all very stressful for me, and I don't know why it's so hard for me to deal with it. But lately I feel like my life is falling apart too." And I've been looking at him, and I've been seeing something familiar in his words that resonates with me. And my own marriage, which I once thought was strong and real, now seems to me as much an illusion as his parents' life. Chris and I were both tied up in the same frustration of not being able to find anything authentic in the people who should be the closest people to us. Before I could say anything, he continued, "I don't want to become them. I don't want to repeat their mistakes, live their lies. You know, I always thought that real connection between people was possible, that one person could really understand the other. But it was probably too naive." I could hear the bitterness in his voice, and his words surprised me, because he wasn't just telling me about his life, he was telling me about his pain, his fears, his aspirations, and I felt my own walls falling down. It turns out we were both looking for the same thing in life. Honesty, simplicity, sincerity. "Chris," I said quietly, not knowing the right words, "you're not naive. Real feelings, they're not an illusion. It's just that sometimes people choose the wrong person." He looked at me for a long time, and in that moment something changed between us. We were talking about ourselves, about our unspoken connection, which was becoming more and more obvious. And when I got home that night, I was overwhelmed with thoughts, and I stood in the kitchen for a long time, looking out the window, trying to ease the tremor that this conversation had caused. And John came home late, looking tired, and he threw his things away, and he went straight to the bedroom. I watched him, realizing how each step he took kept us further apart. The secret life, which I now knew, and our shared life, which he could not or did not want to part with, were now like two parallel realities. The next morning, I finally decided. He looked at me in surprise, but there was no anxiety or excitement in his eyes. Only tiredness. "Do you want to talk?" "Okay." His voice was cold, and something in his eyes was hard to miss. "But what do you want to hear, Julia? That there is nothing left between us? That I no longer know who you are? Or maybe you've chosen a different life for yourself since we've been honest?" His words overwhelmed me. It was the first time he spoke directly, and it was painful, like a blow to the heart. "What do you mean?" I whispered, feeling my hands trembling treacherously. "You know what I mean. We're both pretending. We're playing roles that are long outdated. I'm not sure if you're aware of the changes that are taking place, but I'm sure that you're aware of the changes that are taking place. And I'm sure that you're aware of the changes that are taking place. And I'm sure that you're aware of the changes that are taking place. And I'm sure that you're aware of the changes that are taking place. And I'm sure that you're aware of the changes that are taking place. And I'm sure that you're aware of the changes that are taking place. And I'm sure that you're aware of the changes that are taking place. And I'm sure that you're aware of the changes that are taking place. And I'm sure that you're aware of the changes that are taking place. And I'm sure that you're aware of the changes that are taking place. And I'm sure that you're aware of the changes that are taking place. And I'm sure that you're aware of the changes that are taking place. But instead of fighting for me, he just gave in, choosing the same lie that I've been putting up with for so long. "John, I'm tired," I said quietly. "And you know why? Because all I wanted was for you to still matter to me." And my words sounded like a confession. And in that moment I knew it was over. And finally, he just shook his head, leaving me alone with my pain. And when I went outside, and I felt the fresh evening air, and I realized I couldn't pretend anymore, and I went to my car, and I went to the same coffee shop where Chris and I had met, and my hand was shaking as I was dialing his number, and after a few seconds, he answered, "Juliet, are you okay?" His voice was warm and worried. "No, Chris," I could hardly hold back my tears. "But I need you to know. I can't do it anymore. I can't live in this lie." His voice stopped, and in a second he whispered, "I get it. Where are you?" "It'd be a day." I gave myself permission to get out of my cage, where I had spent too much time, and I was sitting in a cafe, staring at the white ceramic cup of coffee, my fingers twitching, and I was going through my mind about my last conversation with John, and everything I said to him sounded like goodbye, even though we didn't say any specific words. I was devastated, but at the same time I felt a strange relief, like I had finally allowed myself to admit the truth that I had been running from for so long. After a while, Chris came into the cafe, he saw me, and he went straight to the table, and he sat across the table, and he looked me straight in the eye, as if he wanted to know what was going on, but he didn't dare ask. His presence at that moment was the only thing that brought me any comfort. "Julia, what happened?" He asked quietly, his voice was full of anxiety. I looked away, and for a moment I thought about how to put it. Finally, I decided, "I told John the truth, Chris. About us. About our relationship, that it doesn't mean anything, that nothing is real anymore. And it was painful, but I couldn't pretend anymore." He nodded, but I could see that my words left him confused. We both kept silent, feeling this change, this moment that couldn't be ignored. "And now?" Finally, Chris said, his eyes looking for answers in my face. "Are you ready for this to change?" I gasped, not knowing what to say. Maybe I'm just tired of being a prisoner of a life that's long since become alien to me. "Oh no, Chris. I'm not sure I can give up everything that's been the life that I've been used to, but I know for sure that I don't want to live a lie. And I need to know what's next." It was a small move, but it was so much support and understanding that I wanted to embrace it. And I realized that there was something real between us, something that had been going against the rules from the beginning, but now was inevitable, and I spent several days trying to avoid John and stay with my friend until it was over. And I was like, this whole process of going through this was kind of unreal to me, and Chris was my only anchor in the sea of change, and we hadn't been seeing each other since I told him about John, but we were riding each other every day, supporting each other, and one of the times he offered to take me for a walk after school. We came to a small beach near the college, where the air was cool and clear, and the evening sky reflected in the water, and we stood by the rails, silently gazing at the darkening sky. "It's so important that I do anything to let you know that you deserve to be happy." And it sounded too direct, too close, and I felt tears come to my eyes. But I tried to hold him back, and he saw in me more than just a teacher, more than a woman stuck in an unhappy marriage. Chris saw my pain and what I was so desperately looking for, maybe without even realizing it. And I slowly turned to him, and we looked at each other. And in that moment I realized that he meant more to me than I dared to admit. And I did something I would never have done before, allowing myself to be myself without thinking about the consequences. I leaned over and kissed him. It was a short, soft kiss, but it was everything that we hadn't said to each other for so long. Kristen backed down. His hand slipped over my shoulder, and I felt him gently pulling me towards him. And that hug was everything. Support, acceptance, and a sense that we were now inseparably connected, no matter what the future might bring. And the next day, I came home, and I was ready to settle down, and John seemed to know that I was ready to talk. We were sitting across from each other in the living room, and he seemed unusually calm, as if he had already accepted the outcome of this conversation. We were both living in illusions, and now it was impossible to continue. I nodded, realizing that I could no longer deny this truth. "John, I know about Laura," I said quietly, decided to end it once and for all. He looked at me with surprise, but then he just nodded, as if there was nothing more to explain. I didn't expect this confession to be so easy for me. Everything that was bothering me was gone in a second, and I felt a release that I hadn't felt in a long time. "I think we should both move on," he continued. "You deserve someone who will really be with you. And maybe I've already chosen my own path." We said goodbye without saying anything. The marriage I had thought was stable for so many years had broken down with quiet consent, without reproach or quarrel, and when I left a house that was no longer my home, I felt at last free. The days that followed passed in complete silence. I realized that all the bridges had been burned, and now I could start anew. My life had changed radically, and it frightened me. But I had Chris there, who supported me, gave me strength and assurance that everything would be fine. One evening we met in the same cafe where we started our long conversation. He sat across the table and took my hand. We were silent, but the silence was deep and rich. I didn't need to say anything to make him understand how I felt. But know that you are not alone now. I held his hand, and this time I could not hold back my tears. Those tears were not from pain or sorrow, but from the realization that I had finally found myself. I found someone who understood me, who saw me for who I was, who wasn't part of the lie that I had been living in for so long. And now, sitting next to him, I felt like I was ready to move on, that I had someone to walk with me, to be there for me when it was hard, and to be there for me when I needed it most, and for the first time in a long time, I was really happy. The divorce was officially in place, and all of our obligations together were gradually divided into two separate worlds. My decision was like a new life for me, and while I was still learning to live alone, I was walking each day with a sense of confidence that I hadn't felt in a long time. Now, with him, I felt not only alive, but real, and it didn't turn out that way. And gradually I started to notice that something like a rift had formed between me and Chris. Maybe because of the age difference, maybe because of our different goals and expectations. When I decided to break up with John, I thought Chris would be the next chapter in my life, but the reality was more complicated. We started seeing less, and I felt like he was trying to distance himself. And what once seemed like an unbreakable relationship was now looking like a fleeting romance that maybe came at the wrong time. One evening, while we were sitting in the same cafe where we first met, I noticed his alienated gaze and felt that something was wrong. "Chris, what is happening to us?" I asked, unable to bear this feeling of uncertainty any longer. He was silent, looking at the cup of coffee. Finally, he said quietly, "Julia, I don't want to lie to you. I was really trying to find something that would last, but maybe I was wrong. You mean a lot to me, but I'm starting to feel like I can't give you what you're looking for." And his words hit me harder than I could have imagined. I thought everything I'd been through was for something real, but now I realized that maybe this connection was temporary for him. "Chris, but was it real?" I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "I left my old life to be with you, to find myself." He nodded, and his look was painful. "Yes, Julia, it was real, but maybe it was just you trying to figure out who you are. And I don't want to be another person who lets you down." And in that moment, I realized that I had lost not only my marriage, but the one thing that I had hoped for when I destroyed everything, and that he wasn't ready to be there for me in a new life that I was so desperately trying to build. And maybe that was more honest of him than anything else. But the pain of that parting was deeper than anything I'd ever felt before, because I now realized that my journey was my own, and that Chris, no matter how significant, was just one of the episodes that led me to myself. And the next day, I woke up feeling completely alone, but also feeling a new freedom. Now I was all by myself, and though it was scary, I felt a strange relief, and all this journey, all the hard decisions I'd made, had led me to one thing. I didn't want to be dependent on anyone's expectations or feelings anymore. My world was finally mine. I continued to teach. I returned to my work with a new confidence, with a feeling I never had before. My students, as ever, are my life, my inspirations, my little reflections of who I once was and who I have become. Chris left my life, but he left me with the most important thing, myself. Sometimes I think about what my path might have been like if I had stayed with John, if I hadn't allowed myself to feel more and look for more. But looking back, I don't regret it. It was part of the path that taught me a lesson. And now I'm ready to live,